Last summer, when I was writing Confronting Jesus, I had the biggest health scare of my life to date. After a routine scan, I was told that there was a 50-50 chance that I had cancer. And I needed to have some biopsies done to find out whether this was the case or not. It was a very minor procedure to have these biopsies, but I was terrified. I had hoped that my husband could come with me into the room, but I found out at the last minute that he couldn't. And so there I was, and I was needing to just depend upon the Lord. And as I lay there while the doctors were doing their thing, I was praying. I was singing a little song to myself in my head. And then at one point, as I was trying to keep my mind honestly off what was happening to my body, I started reciting the chapter titles for Confronting Jesus. Jesus the Jew, Jesus the Son, Jesus the King, Jesus the Healer, Jesus the Teacher, Jesus the Lover, Jesus the Servant, Jesus the Sacrifice, Jesus the Lord. I said that again and again in my mind. And on that day, I needed Jesus the Healer. But as I look back at that day, what I realize is that it wasn't that I needed Jesus the Healer any more that day than I do today. I just knew my need on that day in a way that so often I don't. If you read through the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you will find stories of Jesus healing all sorts of people. In fact, it seems like Jesus healed hundreds or even thousands of people in the course of his ministry, but the Gospel authors tell us some particular stories in order for us to understand more of our need for him. Towards the beginning of Mark's Gospel, Mark tells a story of a man who had a skin disease known as leprosy coming to Jesus and saying to him, "If you're willing, you can make me clean." It's an interesting way of speaking. We would have said, "If you're willing, you can heal me." But this man, in addition to having a skin disease that was ravaging his body, was also ceremonially unclean. He had to live apart from other people. He was not able to enter the temple to worship God there. And any contact with a leprous man would make the person who touched them unclean as well. How does Jesus respond? He says, "I am willing." And he touches the man and makes him clean. Now we know from other stories in the Gospels, Jesus doesn't need to touch somebody to heal them. In fact, Jesus can heal people from a distance just by saying the word. But in that moment, he chose to touch that leprous man to make him clean. And instead of the uncleanness flowing from that man to Jesus, Jesus' cleanness flowed into him. Shortly after, Mark tells us the story of the paralyzed man who was lowered down from a hole in the roof to Jesus by his friends. Jesus looked at that man and he said, "Son, your sins are forgiven." And the religious leaders were horrified by the blasphemy of Jesus' claim that he could forgive this man's sin. But the other people in the room must just have been confused. This man's legs don't walk. And Jesus is talking like his primary need is to have his sins forgiven. He asks the room the question, which is easier? To say to this man, "Your sins are forgiven," or to say to him, "Get up and take your mat and walk"? And then Jesus says, "So that you can know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, I say to you, get up, take your mat, and walk." In that moment, Jesus proves his power to bring spiritual healing by bringing physical healing to that man. Then Mark tells us that Jesus went and called a tax collector out of his booth to follow him. Now, in those days, the tax collectors were seen as moral filth. They were conspiring with the Romans to extort taxes from their fellow Jews, and they were taking extra for themselves. But when Jesus calls this tax collector, he gets up out of his booth and he follows Jesus right away. In fact, he invites Jesus to dinner with all his tax collector friends. So Jesus is sitting there having dinner with the tax collectors and other known sinners. And the Pharisees come to his disciples and they say, "Why is your master eating with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus says to them this very curious thing. It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I haven't come to call the righteous, but sinners. It's very curious if you read through the accounts of Jesus' life, how often people who are physically sick or whose loved ones are physically sick know that they need Jesus and they come running to him. While the Pharisees and the other religious leaders who think that they are both physically and spiritually well, think that they don't need Jesus at all. But there are a few exceptions. One of my favorites is a man named Jairus, who is described as a synagogue ruler, so a Jewish leader. And one day he runs to Jesus and he pleads with Jesus to come and heal his daughter because his little girl is sick. And Jesus says he'll come. But as they're on the way, a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years comes up to Jesus in the crowd because she thinks to herself, if I can just touch the hem of his garment, I will be made whole. You see, like the leprous man, this bleeding woman was ceremonially unclean. She would have been unable to participate in temple worship, and anyone who touched her would be made unclean as well. She'd spent all her money on doctors, and they hadn't made her better or any worse. She is desperate. And she sneaks up behind Jesus, and she touches his clothes. When Jesus feels the power going out of him, he says, "Who touched me?" His disciples say, what are you talking about? You're surrounded by people, you're in the middle of a crowd, and you're asking, who touched me? But Jesus isn't put off, and he keeps looking around for who has touched him. And so this woman comes forward, she's terrified. She's trembling with fear, and she falls down in front of Jesus and explains what she's done. She is expecting that Jesus is going to tell her off for touching him in her condition. But instead he says these beautiful words, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." There's no one else in the whole of the Gospels whom Jesus calls daughter, but this woman who'd been bleeding for 12 years. It feels like a happy ending to that story in the moment, but immediately messengers come from Jairus' house and they tell him the terrible news. Your daughter is dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore. But Jesus looks at Jairus and he says, do not be afraid, only believe. And then he goes with Jairus to his house. When they get there, people are wailing and mourning for this little girl. And Jesus says, why are you weeping? She's not dead, she's asleep. They laugh at him. But Jesus sends the crowd away and he takes his 3 closest disciples and this little girl's parents to where she's lying dead. And he says to her, Talitha kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. He takes her by the hand and lifts her up. He tells her parents to give her something to eat. Again, touching a dead body could make you ceremonially unclean. But Jesus cannot be made unclean by this girl. Instead, his life flows into her as he wakes her up from death as easily as you or I could wake somebody from sleep. I don't know how you feel today. I don't know whether you're fighting fit or fighting for your life. I don't know whether death feels far away or like it's staring you in the face. But I do know one thing. Like me today, you need Jesus the healer. And if you put your trust in him, then one day, when you're dead and buried, he will call you out of your grave as easily as he called that little girl out of death. Talitha kumi, I say to you, little girl, get up. And if we put our trust in Jesus, even if our bodies are ravaged and dead, he will call us back to life, and we will be made whole.